Yes, thank you very much for the organization and for having me. In my PhD project, I deal with anti-Semitism, nationalism, and authoritarianism in the international climate movement. I mainly analyze the functions, appeal, and forms of expression of modern anti-Semitism. And I've so far identified three main forms of anti-Semitism within the climate movement. And by the way, I do not have a presentation, so you'll have to listen. Firstly, Israel-related anti-Semitism often occurs in the climate movement, and Israel serves as a target for anti-Semitic projection, so that anti-Semitism does not openly refer to Jews as Jews, but to Israel. Israel is singled out and seen as the embodiment of evil. And this is often based on the fundamental division of the world into the global north and the global south, coming from a traditional anti-imperialist worldview or often also from post-colonial views. Israel also serves as a projection screen for some activists for their own colonial past by portraying Israel as an absolutely evil colonial and apartheid state. Feelings of guilt and shame due to their own historical past are externalized and projected onto the Jewish state. And severe hostility to Israel is the most blatant form of anti-Semitism in the climate movement. For example, some Fridays for Future activists celebrate Palestinian terrorists as martyrs, and some groups call for so-called climate intifada. And also the strong anti-Israel views of the popular climate activist Greta Thunberg have also been widely discussed. Secondly, there are numerous conspiracy narratives in the climate movement, which often implicitly operate with the old anti-Semitic image of a Jewish world conspiracy. Conspiracy narratives offer simplified and personalized accusations, for example, by holding the elites responsible in complex, ambivalent, and abstract situations. And such narratives offer many starting points for traditional anti-Semitic stereotypes and resentments. And thirdly, there are also openly Shoah relativizing expressions in the movement, such as those made by Roger Hallam. He's made several Shoah comparisons to emphasize the seriousness of the climate crisis. And I'll come back to him in a minute. Such statements do exist, but they are not common, and other actors often immediately distance themselves from them. As I'm trying to analyze why anti-Semitism, authoritarianism, and nationalism are attractive for climate activists and how the worldviews and positions of some activists and groups are linked to these ideologies, I want to introduce you to two visionaries of the movement. I want to show how the authors Roger Hallam and Andreas Malm influenced the climate movement through their writings. By analyzing their texts, it is possible to show why anti-Semitism is also reflected in progressive movements and is not just a random product of misguided developments. Roger Hallam is the British co-founder of the group Extinction Rebellion and is now active in climate groups like Just Stop Oil. And he's also linked to the new British Your Party by Jeremy Corbyn and Sarah Sultana. And both Sultana and Corbyn are well known for the hatred of Israel, and the new party is ideologically united by its anti-Israel stance. However, Hallam's stated primary goal is climate protection, which he aims to achieve through a mass activist movement. And if democratic principles stand in the way of rapid climate protection, Hallam also opposes democracy. In an interview, he said, I quote, "When a society acts so immorally, as in relation to climate change, democracy becomes irrelevant." Also, right at the beginning of his book, he writes, "The task at hand, radical collective action against the political regime which is planning our collective suicide." This statement seems conspiracy ideologically because he assumes that, quote, "our genocidal governments are planning the collective suicide of the population by failing to combat climate change, which he conceptualizes as, I quote, "the greatest crime of all." This worldview at least provides a basis for anti-Semitic conspiracy narratives in which powerful and evil elites want to harm the good people. And this is, if you ask Roger Hallam, to be countered by rebellion. And for this rebellion, he's building a querfront, a cross-front. He writes, "However, with the climate crisis and ecological breakdown, there is a unique opportunity to play the right at its own game, because in this case, the arguments are genuinely universalist. There is then a massive opportunity to build up right-wing support." And these broad alliances Hallam wants to create are all too often held together by authoritarian dispositions, collectivist friend-foe constructions, and conspiracy ideological anti-Semitic explanations of the world. Hallam portrays climate change as a highly emotionalized apocalyptic catastrophe and impending doom. In his narrative, there are only the roles of friend or foe. He combines this dualistic contrast with the populist concept of the so-called elite. The ruling elite, which, according to Hallam, thinks only of money and power, controls the media and sets the political agenda. It is considered a puppet master and directs the fate of the world from behind the scenes. And in contrast to this evil elite, there is a pure people he wants to become active in the climate movement. That explains how Hallam comes to the following proposal. I quote, "There can be no more elections. Elections create power. And as long as there is this power, there will be no room for the person and their dignity." Hallam moves away very quickly from an, in principle, understandable critique of parliamentarianism and questions of representation, inclusion, and diversity, and reveals his highly anti-democratic stance. He considers modern democracy and political parties to be manipulative, corrupt, and designed to preserve the status quo. The Manichaean and supposedly apocalyptic battle between good and evil in a situation of absolute urgency leaves no room for differentiation, ambiguity, and complexity. Hallam does not offer a deeper and more substantiated critique of capitalism and capitalist society in the face of multiple crises and climate change. Instead, he holds individual people accountable and seeks for someone to blame. And we can see that Hallam employs several forms of anti-Semitism, from conspiracy beliefs about the elites that he suspects being behind climate change, to relativizing the Shoah, which he equates with the climate crisis. In his new book, Hallam then clearly articulates his anti-modern resentment. He writes, "Whatever this modernity thing is, it is not working." And I'll come back to what this means for his perception of the world later. But first, I will introduce the second author, Andreas Malm, and his writings. Andreas Malm. The Swedish eco-socialist is considered a thought leader of the radical wing of the international climate movement and became well known for his book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, in 2020. Malm characterizes today's world as a state without nature, in which humans have distanced themselves too far from nature. He attributes the beginning of this state of domination over nature to the exploitation of fossil fuels, driven by greed for profit and the pursuit of power. In the struggle for climate stability, Malm calls for simple, binary, friend or foe schemes. For Malm, there's only good and evil. He is concerned with the destruction of the parasitic, elitist, and increasingly contaminated ruling class, and the dissolution of the capitalist class, an anti-Semitic charge also known as the top 1%. According to Malm, the climate crisis occupies a, quote, similar place to Auschwitz in Adorno's writings, as a catastrophe in which history as a whole is unleashed. Following this relativizing reference to Auschwitz, it seems only logical that Malm seeks blueprints for climate protests in the midst of the Palestinian liberation struggle. For him, Palestine is a prophetic index or a testing ground for violence and repression, which will later affect the whole world. In view of the climate crisis, at least the Palestinian experience of displacement and homesickness is on the verge of becoming universal. However, the relationship between Palestine and climate change is more than an allegory or analogy. According to Andreas Malm, there is an integral connection between Palestine, fossil fuels, and climate change, as he attempts to show in a historical overview of the armed conflicts in the Middle East since 1839. He writes that through the use of superior mechanical weapons and with the help of fossil fuels, especially steamships, the British and later the Zionists succeeded in occupying Palestine. According to him, fossil fuel-based and imperialist capitalism and the exploitation of nature through technology are at the root of the specific destruction of Palestine and the destruction caused by climate change in general. For him, Israel is complicit in climate change through its access to and consumption of fossil fuels and should therefore be destroyed. While the authentic indigenous Palestinian culture was able to appreciate the beauty of the land and is connected to the soil in a special way, The Zionists envy the indigenous people for their natural and genuine connection to the land and nature. And I assume that several presentations here will be given on the discourse around indigeneity and settler colonialism and the notion of Palestinians as indigenous, which is why I will not delve deeper into that trope. However, Malm imagines the Palestinians, through their assumed roots in the land, as particularly resistant to the declared enemy. It is striking how Malm glorifies a resistant nature, personified in the supposedly close-to-nature Palestinian resistance fighters. The Palestinians, also a projection screen of course, allegedly want to preserve the original, pure nature as opposed to capitalist progress and destruction. According to Malm, the Zionists cannot form a real and authentic state. According to him, the Palestinian population finds itself in one damn Nakba after another, against which it rebels. Malm understands Palestinian resistance as a specific experience in a situation where everything seems hopeless. This Palestinian resilience is referred to as sumud. The Palestinians refuse to submit to the enemy and survive in their land despite all adversities. Malm therefore advocates for a global climate sumud from which hope can be drawn in the current situation. Palestinian resistance as a pioneer for climate projection and resilience. Malm then begins his latest essay called The Destruction of Palestine is the Destruction of the Earth after 7 October 2023 with the following words, I quote, "The first thing we said in these early hours consisted not so much of words as of cries of jubilation. Those of us who have lived our lives with and through the question of Palestine could not react in any other way to the scenes of the resistance storming the Erez checkpoint. How could we not scream with astonishment and joy?" In the essay, Malm describes his view of the situation. Israel, the settler colonial occupying power, is now committing genocide in Gaza and is being supported in this by the rest of the capitalist West. In traditional anti-imperialist manner, Malm regards Israel as a henchman and a proxy of the United States. And he hates both the United States and Israel as embodiments of capitalist modernity. But for Malm, it is Israel that must be destroyed first and foremost. Both the destruction of Gaza and the climate crisis take on apocalyptic proportions in Malm's view, and genocide and ecocide merge. He concludes that Israel must be destroyed in order to save the climate. Malm sees a conflict between nature on the one hand, represented by the image of the Palestinians, and technology on the other, represented by the image of the Israeli state and the military. And he imagines himself as part of nature's rebellion against technology. Malm's theory and worldview combine vulgar anti-imperialism with the oversimplified notion of post-colonialism. He only recognizes oppressors and oppressed, and he has no critical concept of the state or of capitalist society. Inspired by anti-colonial guerrilla warfare, the left-wing climate movement is supposed to wage an apocalyptic struggle against fossil fuel-based imperialist capitalism, which is personified by the USA and Israel. For Malm, the struggle for climate justice is therefore inevitably linked to the Palestinian struggle against Israel. The destruction of Palestine is the destruction of the earth. Israel must be destroyed in order to save the earth. And this requires the physical violence and terror admired by Malm, including in the form of the anti-Semitic organizations he supports, such as Hamas and Islamic Jihad. A better world cannot be achieved with Malm. The world should simply not come to an end. And especially after the perceived or actual failure of the climate movement's ecological crisis-solving strategies and its decline since 2020, the shift toward an anti-Semitic worldview promises new hope and a promise of salvation for the movement. The enemy clearly identified in anti-Semitism can be defeated, which, unlike victory over the climate crisis, seems achievable. And I will now, in my last 4 minutes, I will present 3 further motives that were identified in my analysis of several writings of the climate movement and that offer at least entry points for anti-Semitism, nationalism, and authoritarianism. First, the anti-modern resentment as such. According to critical theory, anti-Semitism can be understood as a rebellious sentiment against certain aspects of modernity, mediated by the subject and loaded with resentment. Anti-Semitism is an anti-modern ideology that personifies all social and psychosocial problems, contradictions, and transformations in Jews. In the anti-Semitic fantasy of the figure of the Jew, all contradictions and conflicts and everything complex, abstract and difficult about modern capitalist society can be comprehensively and personifiedly made tangible. Abstract social conditions are blamed on individuals. And anti-modern reactions, characterized by prejudice, stereotypes, and authoritarian thought patterns, offer explanations and meaning in response to modernization and the social and economic changes that are perceived as destructive. In modern anti-Semitism, the Jews are held responsible for the malaise in modernity, as well for the general sense of dependency and powerlessness, exploitation, oppression, and isolation, and are hated accordingly. And I argue that it could therefore be said that the climate movement is processing its own failure, its sense of powerlessness, fear, and anger in the face of a massive crisis by turning to anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism in relation to the Jewish state also serves to reduce complexity. Complex social challenges and conflicts are reified as the Jewish question and the problem of the Jewish state. And as I've shown for some climate activists, this means that the climate crisis can only be overcome if the Jewish state is also overcome. Second, the positive reference to nature and authenticity and the longing for an unspoiled, intact nature. In some cases I've analyzed, a resistant nature is glorified and should be preserved. Nature is seen as pure and authentic, in contrast to abstract capitalist progress and its destructive effects. Andreas Malm in particular personifies this nature in the supposedly natural Palestinians and their resistance fighters, in contrast to an artificial, inauthentic Israeli state. Nature is imagined as autonomous, opposed to human society, and independent. Human activity must submit to nature. Nature is an external constraint. Humanity must adapt to those supposedly natural constraints or be destroyed by them. And in the thinking of some climate activists, quick and decisive decisions must be made in the name of survival when needed. And they will be enforced by authority and force against other people if necessary. So it's no surprise to see a bit of activist heroism and distrust of democratic processes there. The crisis of capitalist society is acknowledged in ecological crisis thinking, but capitalist society as such is often considered irreversible. In this respect, all human action is subject to the question of whether or not it is appropriate to supposed nature and its limits. Society is thus transformed into nature by the detour that nature supposedly determines society. And this leads to the reversion that the need for freedom, the search for utopia, and fundamental criticism of the prevailing are reversed in their cementation, because the conditions themselves are ultimately understood as irrevocable as first nature. And in addition, in the climate movement, there are also so-called deep ecological approaches in the relationship between humans and nature. Deep ecology describes a spiritual, esoteric philosophy that calls for harmony between humans and nature, assuming that human and non-human life forms are equal. According to this philosophy, humans do not have a superior position. In deep ecology, the well-being and survival of nature and animals are therefore accorded just as much importance as humans' life. The deep ecological understanding of a pure and holistic nature opens the door to misanthropic ideas. Social inequalities and racist, sexist, or anti-Semitic ideologies can be legitimized by their supposed naturalness. And my last point would be that Palestine serves as a site of authenticity and nationalist belonging for some activists. Palestine, as a collective source of legitimacy and identification, creates a sense of belonging for many activists. It provides common enemies and a shared vision. Most left-wing activists believe they are fighting for the oppressed and that they are standing on the side of justice. They want to be on the side of good and stand by the underdog, Palestine. And the reference to a nation as a category of collective subjectivity offers internal integration and provides meaning and a fixed point in complex modernity and its adversities. As a supposed natural collective, the nation offers security, stability, and community in the face of the complexity and contradictions of modernity. And while climate activists do usually not resolve contradictions at the national level, they shift to a global perspective and find an anchor in the projectively charged image of Palestine, to which they relate uncritically and affirmatively. The national offers a refuge from real powerlessness and despair, with the negative foil of the other, the evil, the inauthentic, is delivered at the same time. And I have one last sentence. My outlook is relatively bleak. In my opinion, political groups with progressive aspirations must also criticize the false social relations between people and capitalism, domination and exploitation in materialistic terms, and question the contradictions of modern capitalist society without allowing themselves to be driven mad by simplistic and personalized offers for crisis management. There must be ways to tackle the climate crisis without perpetuating anti-Semitic ways of thinking, to tolerate ambiguities and contradictions, and to point towards utopian visions. Thank you.